the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 33, The Cost of Harmony, Losing Yourself in Agreement. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, the space where we sit with the emotions most people rush past and name the things that live in the shadows of everyday life. We're now moving through the fourth arc of this series, the relational arc Mirrors, Bridges, and Boundaries. If you're joining us here for the first time, the journey so far has carried us through three arcs already. Shadow emotions, where we explored the feelings many of us are taught to hide. Integration and alchemy, where we learned how to turn pain into power. And ashes to architecture, where we rebuilt life piece by piece after the collapse. This arc asks us to look closely at what happens in the fragile spaces between self and other, the mirrors, the bridges, the walls we build, and the boundaries we test. Today's episode turns to the cost of harmony, the hidden price we sometimes pay to keep the peace. On the surface, agreement feels safe, even noble, but underneath it can mean self-silencing, erasure, and a slow drift away from our true selves. We'll explore moments of fawning, people-pleasing, and the quiet ache of holding back our truth. You'll hear personal reflection, grounded psychological insight, and strategies for recognizing when harmony is a genuine connection and when it's just another disguise for avoidance. Because peace is precious, but not if it costs us ourselves. So let's begin. The shadow side of peace. When we talk about harmony, it often sounds like something pure and noble, a state worth striving for. But harmony has a shadow side, and sometimes the very peace we cling to comes at the cost of ourselves. Themes and attributes fawning. The survival strategy of appeasing others to keep relationships stable. Self-erasure, silencing, or minimizing your own needs to avoid conflict. False peace, mistaking quietness or lack of argument for true harmony. Inner conflict, the tension between external calm and the storm within. The cost of quiet silence can look like safety. Rooms feel calmer when no one names the tension. Relationships look fine when nothing is challenged. But quiet isn't always peace. Sometimes it's pressure with the volume turned down. False harmony works like a soft rug laid over broken tiles. It hides the cracks, but you still trip on them. The more we prioritize smoothness over truth, the more those unseen fractures spread. Real peace can hold honesty. False peace can't survive it. This part is about noticing when calm is compliance and when keeping the peace is quietly costing you. Personal reflection. There was a time I dated someone who, from the beginning, told me they could become obsessive. They were open about it, too open maybe, and I spoke up straight away. I said obsession isn't love, and that dependency can't grow into something healthy, in my opinion. I wanted mutual ground, reciprocity, a relationship that was about balance rather than control. At first, they reassured me. They gave me the words I wanted to hear. But as time passed, their behavior didn't match those words. I noticed the incongruence and tried to raise it. Each time what I said was dismissed, minimized, or explained away. And over time I started to go quiet. I stopped raising the little things. I swallowed my discomfort to keep the peace. I convinced myself that silence was strength, but it was self-erasure. It was giving up pieces of myself to avoid conflict I feared would lead to rupture. The cost of that false harmony was high because every time I silenced myself, I traded inner peace for external calm. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep doing it. The bridges between us weren't repairable, at least not without me losing myself in the process. And so I ended it, not because I didn't care, but because I finally saw that my inner harmony was worth more than a fragile surface level peace. Psychological insight psychologists often talk about fawning, Walker 2013, as one of the lesser discussed trauma responses. Where fight, flight, or freeze are more visible, fawning shows up as appeasement, smoothing things over, avoiding conflict, and sacrificing personal truth to keep someone else comfortable. It can feel like love, but it's fear wearing harmony's mask. In my situation, I thought I was choosing compassion by not speaking up, but really, I was falling into the trap of false peace, mistaking the absence of conflict for health. Research on relationship dynamics, Gottman, 1999, shows that unresolved issues pushed underground rarely disappear. They resurface as resentment, distance, or collapse. The irony is that conflict, when approached with honesty and respect, can be the very thing that strengthens a relationship. Silence, on the other hand, slowly weakens it. My choice to stop speaking up wasn't kindness, it was fear disguised as harmony. And in the end, it became clear that any relationship demanding my silence wasn't a safe space for my truth. Insight prompts. Where in your life have you mistaken silence for peace? What parts of yourself have you downplayed or hidden just to keep someone else comfortable? What would it look like to honor your truth, even if it risks disrupting false harmony? Theory in action, one honest line. Choose one relationship where you've been keeping the peace at your own expense. This week, speak a single clear line that honors your truth without attack, e.g., I value us, and I also need us to slow the pace. I'm not comfortable rushing this. Afterwards, journal two things. One, how your body felt before and after saying it. And two, whether the calm that followed felt like true peace or simply a reset into silence. Self-erasure in everyday life. Not all self-betrayals are dramatic. Most happen quietly, a softened answer, a swallowed truth, a nod that says fine when it isn't. This section looks at the micro moves that trade authenticity for smoothness, the places where keeping it easy slowly becomes losing yourself, themes and attributes social masking, adapting your presentation to keep others comfortable, conflict avoidance, skipping honest dialogue to maintain appearances, internalized silence, learning and rehearsing the habit of not speaking, micro betrayals of self, small compromises that add up over time. Body cues, how tension, breath, and fatigue signal self-erasure. The smooth surface picture a lake at dawn. Still glassy, flawless. That smoothness looks like peace, until you realize the stillness is held there by effort. You stop throwing pebbles. You hold your breath. You tiptoe around the edge so nothing ripples. That's how self-erasure begins. We manage the surface so carefully that we forget water is meant to move. The price of a mirror-perfect lake is that nothing living can break it. It's beautiful, but it doesn't breathe. Personal reflection. I've caught myself choosing the smooth surface in small, ordinary ways. In a group setting, someone would slide into talking about a person who wasn't there, and I'd feel that internal flinch. I don't like speaking behind people's backs. It doesn't sit with who I am, but I'd stay quiet to keep the mood light. Other times, I watched people switch masks depending on who entered the room. The energy shifted, the tone changed, and it made me check myself. Am I being consistent, or am I smoothing the moment at my own expense? What I noticed was simple and sobering. Every time I chose silence to preserve the vibe, I felt it in my body, a shallow breath, a tight jaw, a tiredness that wasn't just physical. The room stayed calm, but I left carrying the cost. Psychological insight. This pattern maps to people-pleasing and self-silencing, strategies that prioritize social harmony over inner congruence. Social psychology describes pluralistic ignorance. Prentice and Miller, 1993. Many individuals privately disagree, but go along because they assume everyone else agrees. My quiet in those rooms wasn't neutrality, it was tacit consent. There's also congruence from Carl Rogers. Psychological health grows when inner experience and outer expression align. Each time I stayed silent, I widened that gap. I could feel it somatically, my shoulders tight, my breath held, a cue that my behavior had drifted from my values. So I experimented with one tiny shift. Instead of confronting, I tried a gentle, congruent line. I'd rather not talk about them when they're not here. The first time I said it, my heart raced, but afterwards my body softened. The room didn't explode, the topic simply moved. That small practice taught me something essential. Honesty doesn't have to be harsh to be clear, and peace that includes my truth is lighter to carry. Insight prompts. Where do you most often choose the smooth surface over your honest voice? What does your body do, breath, jaw, shoulders, stomach, when you're erasing yourself? What is one sentence that would honor your values without escalating conflict? Theory in action, the one sentence truth, micro boundary practice. This week, prepare one calm, values aligned line you can use when self erasure tempts you. Examples. I see it differently, and I'd like to keep it simple today. Let's skip talking about them if they're not here. I need a moment to think before I answer. Use it once. Afterwards, note two things. One, how your body feels, and two, whether the peace that follows feels truer than silence. The hidden cost of peacekeeping, Keeping the peace often looks noble from the outside, but beneath the surface, the cost can be high. Every time we swallow a truth, silence a discomfort, or let something slide for the sake of harmony, it leaves a trace. Over time, those traces add up, and they don't disappear just because no conflict erupted. They quietly collect in the body, in the heart, in the spaces where authenticity should live. This part explores the subtle but heavy burden of self-erasure. How emotional labor and internalized silence can smooth the surface of a relationship, while underneath, tension builds like pressure under polished wood. It asks us to consider, what are we paying for peace, and is the exchange worth it? Themes and attributes emotional labor, the invisible effort of carrying unspoken weight to preserve external calm. Internalized silence, the habit of suppressing truth or discomfort until it becomes part of identity. Erosion of authenticity, how repeated self-erasure chips away at the clarity of who we are. The long game of truth, recognizing that harmony built on silence rarely lasts. The polished table, imagine a wooden table that looks beautiful on the surface. It's been polished until it gleams, every mark hidden beneath layers of varnish. But underneath, the wood is cracked, warped from years of pressure, and ready to splinter at the slightest strain. That's what peacekeeping often feels like. The appearance of harmony masking a structure that can't truly bear weight. The shine fools the eye, but it doesn't erase the fractures. Personal reflection. I've had moments where silence seemed easier than truth. There was a time in a relationship where I noticed more and more inconsistencies, words that promised reassurance, but behavior that contradicted them. At first, I tried to raise it, but each time I spoke, my concerns were dismissed or minimized. Eventually, I fell into silence. I told myself it wasn't worth the conflict, that keeping things calm mattered more, but the silence came at a cost. Inside, I carried tension that never had a voice. I felt smaller, as if the parts of me that needed to be seen had no space. It was peace on the surface, but unrest beneath it. Looking back, I can see how much of myself I set aside just to keep the table polished. And in the end, the cracks showed anyway. Psychological insight psychologists often describe this pattern as emotional labor. Hochschild, 1983, the work of managing feelings and expressions to keep external peace. It's not just about avoiding conflict. It's about shouldering an invisible burden that others may never even notice. Silence becomes internalized over time. What begins as a choice not to speak can harden into identity. I'm someone who doesn't make waves. This links to research on self-silencing, Jack and Dill, 1992, a pattern particularly common in relationships where one person prioritizes the other's comfort over their truth. I felt this firsthand. Each time I chose quiet over honesty, I thought I was avoiding disruption. But what I was doing was reinforcing a split between my inner world and outer actions. That incongruence is exhausting. It wears down authenticity until you begin to question whether you even know your own needs anymore. A hard truth is this: silence does not protect harmony forever. It only delays disruption, often making the eventual rupture sharper. True peace can't be sustained by hiding. It requires the courage of presence. Insight prompts: where have you chosen silence as a way of keeping peace? What unspoken truths might be shaping your sense of self more than you realize? How do you distinguish between restraint and erasure in your relationships? Theory and action. This week, try naming one small truth that you've been holding back, not in confrontation, but in gentle clarity. It could be as simple as saying, I felt a little overlooked when that happened, or I prefer this instead. Notice how speaking it feels in your body, and whether the silence that follows is lighter or heavier than before. The silent cost keeping the peace is often praised as maturity, but silence has its own price. When we bite our tongues too often, the words don't just vanish, they sink inward, shaping how we see ourselves. This part explores the hidden cost of silence, how the desire to avoid conflict can gradually train us to erase parts of who we are. Themes and attributes: conflict avoidance, choosing quiet over confrontation, even when the issue matters. Self-erosion, how unspoken truths slowly diminish our sense of authenticity. False harmony, peace maintained on the surface while tension brews underneath. Emotional residue, the lingering weight of what was never said. Personal reflection, I remember being in a group where people often spoke differently depending on who was in the room. Masks came on and off, one face for one person, another for someone else. Gossip would flow freely once someone left, and while I never joined in, being present made me uneasy. For me, it was a mirror. It reflected the question, do I do this too? Do I change my tone depending on who's watching? I don't like to talk behind people's backs, so seeing this dynamic so clearly forced me to examine my actions. It showed me how silence, even without words of my own, could feel like complicity. I realized that by saying nothing, I wasn't just protecting peace in the room, I was also allowing a part of myself to shrink. That awareness pushed me to draw firmer lines about when to speak up and when to step away. Psychological insight silence doesn't just keep the peace. Over time, it can erode the foundations of self. Psychologists studying learned helplessness, Seligman, 1975, found that when individuals repeatedly feel their voice makes no difference, they stop trying to express themselves at all. What begins as a choice to let it slide gradually becomes a pattern of resignation. In my experience, moments when I stayed quiet weren't just about protecting harmony, they slowly taught me to mistrust my perspective. Each unspoken truth chipped away at self respect, and the cost wasn't just relational, it was internal. This is why silence carries such weight. It doesn't only protect others from discomfort, it teaches us to make ourselves invisible. Over time, that invisibility shapes identity, convincing us that our truth is too disruptive to exist out loud. The longer it goes unchallenged, the harder it becomes to reverse. Insight prompts. Where in your life has silence felt easier than honesty? What has that silence cost you internally? How can you begin reclaiming your voice without needing to shout? Theory and action. This week, notice one small moment where your instinct is to stay quiet. Before you withdraw, pause and ask, am I protecting peace or erasing myself? If it feels safe, speak a single truth in a gentle but clear way. For example, I feel differently about this and I'd like to share my view. The aim isn't to argue, but to let your voice exist in the space. The weight of agreement. There's a subtle exhaustion that comes from always nodding along. At first, it feels harmless, an easy way to keep conversations smooth, to keep the atmosphere light. But over time, constant agreement doesn't just drain energy, it reshapes identity. When we agree too often, we start to forget what we think. This part explores the emotional weight of agreement, how it can feel safe in the moment but leave us hollow after, and how reclaiming disagreement can restore both vitality and self respect. Themes and attributes surface peace, how automatic agreement maintains calm while hiding tension underneath. Energetic drain, the quiet fatigue that comes from always suppressing your truth. Identity dilution, the gradual fading of personal perspective under constant conformity. Restorative disagreement, how saying no or I see it differently can reawaken authenticity. Personal reflection, I recall spending time in a workplace where meetings often turned into echo chambers. One person would put forward an idea, and everyone else would nod, sometimes before the point was even finished. I found myself doing the same, nodding, agreeing, not because I believed in every suggestion, but because it felt easier. At first, it seemed harmless, but later, walking away from those meetings, I noticed a heaviness in my chest, like I'd left pieces of myself at the table. I wasn't agreeing because I truly believed. I was agreeing because I didn't want to rock the boat or risk becoming the difficult one. What struck me most was realizing that people started to assume my silence or my nod meant consent, even commitment. I'd then be tasked with things I never actually supported, simply because I didn't speak up. That's when I understood. Every time I gave away my yes too cheaply, I was also giving away my energy. Psychological insight research into social conformity, Ash 1951, shows how powerfully group pressure can override personal judgment. People will often conform outwardly even when they inwardly disagree, just to avoid social friction. Over time, this disconnect between inner truth and outer behavior leads to what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of living in contradiction. In my own experience, the weight of agreement wasn't just external, it was internal. The more I agreed outwardly, the less I trusted myself inwardly. I started questioning whether my perspective mattered, or if it was simply easier to let others decide for me. That's the cost of harmony, the quiet erosion of self-belief. What begins as small, habitual nods of agreement can accumulate until they become an entire way of relating. Breaking that cycle often requires reclaiming disagreement not as conflict, but as honesty, a reminder that connection doesn't require uniformity. Insight prompts. When have you found yourself nodding along, even when you didn't fully agree? What do you think you were protecting in that moment? Yourself, the relationship, or the peace of the group? How might gentle disagreement feel like an act of respect, both for yourself and the other person? Theory and action. Next time you catch yourself agreeing automatically, pause before responding. Instead of nodding, try a phrase that keeps the door open without betraying your truth. For example, "That's an interesting point. I see part of it differently." Notice how the simple act of expressing difference lightens the weight of false harmony and allows connection on more. The weight of silence. There are moments in life when silence feels safer than words. We bite our tongues, swallow the truth, and hope the storm will pass. At first, it feels protective, as if not speaking will keep the peace or prevent damage. But over time, that silence begins to weigh us down. What we don't say accumulates, layer upon layer, until it becomes a quiet burden we carry within. This part explores the difference between silence as protection and silence as collusion. We'll look at how unspoken words can create distance, foster resentment, and even allow harmful dynamics to continue unchecked. And we'll ask, what does it take to move from silence that suffocates to voice that liberates? Themes and attributes protective silence, choosing quiet as a deliberate act of restraint when words would only inflame. The cost of unspoken words, how silence accumulates inside, often leaving guilt, resentment, or regret. Silent collusion, when not speaking up, allows harmful narratives or behaviors to go unchallenged. Reclaiming voice, learning to reintroduce words as a bridge between authenticity and connection. Personal reflection. I've noticed in myself the way silence can become its kind of agreement. There was a time I stood among people I thought I knew well, watching as conversations shifted depending on who entered the room. Some wore masks, behaving one way with one person, another way with someone else. I don't speak behind people's backs, but I realized in my quietness I was still part of that cycle. My silence wasn't neutral. It reflected to me the question, was I complicit by not saying anything, or was I protecting myself from unnecessary conflict? That realization unsettled me. I had to check my actions to see if I was living up to my values or simply avoiding discomfort. It wasn't about exposing others or confronting every inconsistency, but about asking whether my silence was protecting my peace or betraying my integrity. Psychological insight. Psychologically, silence has two faces. On one side, it's a healthy tool, a pause that gives space for reflection, or a restraint that prevents escalation. This is what communication researchers call strategic silence, Bruno, 1973, the intentional withholding of words to maintain control or invite deeper listening. On the other side, silence can slip into what psychologists describe as silent collusion, when not speaking effectively reinforces unhealthy behavior. Social psychologist Albert Bandura's work on moral disengagement suggests that by staying silent, we can distance ourselves from responsibility, even if our silence allows harm to continue. I've seen this play out in my own experience. When I stood quietly among people who shifted masks depending on who was present, I thought I was simply keeping the peace. But in reality, I was learning the cost of unspoken words. My silence didn't challenge the duplicity, it let it breathe. It was a wake-up call. Silence, when habitual, can turn from self-protection into passive permission. Reclaiming voice doesn't mean speaking in every moment or forcing confrontation. It's about discernment, knowing when silence protects and when it betrays. True resilience isn't just the strength to stay quiet, but the courage to speak when silence becomes too heavy to carry. Insight prompts. Where in your life has silence protected you, and where has it betrayed you? What patterns of silence do you notice in yourself when conflict arises? How can you tell the difference between restraint and complicity? Theory and action. This week, notice one situation where your silence feels heavy. Instead of breaking it with confrontation, start small. Write down the words you wish you could say. By putting them into language, even privately, you reclaim your voice. The act itself can reveal whether those words are best spoken aloud, or whether being clear with yourself is the step you most need. The cost of peace. Sometimes the biggest battles are the ones no one sees, not fought in arguments but in the quiet corners of our hearts. On the outside, everything looks calm, but inside we're fractured, paying a hidden price for peace that isn't real. This part explores the final layer of losing yourself in agreement, when harmony stops being a bridge and instead becomes a form of self-erasure. Our themes and attributes: false harmony, outward peace that hides inward fracture; self-erasure, the danger of making yourself invisible for agreement; restorative integrity, choosing authenticity, even at the risk of tension; personal reflection. I can remember a time when I was in a friendship where every gathering ended with a joke at my expense. They weren't cruel on the surface. People laughed, and I often laughed along too. But inside I felt it cut deeper each time. For a while I told myself it was harmless, that keeping the mood light mattered more than my discomfort. Eventually I realized what I was doing, trading pieces of my self-respect for a kind of group peace. By not speaking up, I was silently agreeing that it was okay to diminish me, even when I knew it wasn't. That moment forced me to ask, was I keeping the peace, or was I erasing myself to keep others comfortable? When I finally addressed it, not everyone took it well. Some thought I was being oversensitive. But what surprised me was that one or two admitted they had felt the same in different ways, and had also stayed quiet. By breaking the silence, I didn't just reclaim my dignity, I permitted others to do the same. Psychological insight. This is the cost of false peace. It creates a surface level calm while fueling hidden fractures beneath. In psychology, this aligns with the concept of self-silencing, Jack and Dill 1992, where individuals suppress their feelings and needs in order to preserve relationships. At first, it can seem like a small compromise, but over time, self-silencing leads to resentment, depression, and a diminished sense of identity. I think back to that friendship circle, and I see how the pattern grew. Every time I laughed along, I reinforced the dynamic. By choosing silence, I was unconsciously teaching others that it was acceptable to cross my boundary. It wasn't malice on their part, it was permission on mine. The turning point came when I understood that authenticity isn't about being confrontational, but about being congruent. Speaking up didn't end every friendship, but it clarified which ones were real and which ones were only sustained through my silence. And that's the cost worth paying, not losing yourself, but letting go of peace that was never honest to begin with. Insight prompts. Where have you mistaken harmony for health, only to realize later that it was a disguise for self-erasure? What's one area of your life where your silence feels heavier than the conflict you're trying to avoid? Who shows you that peace and honesty can coexist? Theory and action. This week, notice one situation where you feel tempted to stay silent for the sake of harmony. Before responding, ask yourself, is this silence protecting me or is it erasing me? If it's the latter, experiment with a gentle truth. Even a small sentence like, I laugh along, but it doesn't feel good, can be enough to restore integrity without starting a war. The cost of harmony keeping the peace can sometimes cost more than conflict ever would. Each time we silence ourselves for harmony, we trade a piece of truth for a temporary calm. And over time, that silence begins to echo louder than words. Not every disagreement needs to divide us, and not every relationship is lost because we speak what is real. What matters is learning when peace is genuine and when it's simply self-erasure. The harmony worth keeping is the one where your voice still belongs. The rest isn't harmony at all, it's forgetting yourself in someone else's song. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and let your truth have a place in the peace you keep. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of the Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.